So nice to see everyone again. Welcome back to Biology 1120. We are completing our lecture on the brain today. You might hear some drilling in the background. If it sounds very loud to me, I don't know what it sounds like to you. If it's too loud and you can't hear me, then I'll speak louder or we might have to stop. So please let me know if you can't hear me, okay? The cerebrum. Remember our directional terms, rostral, which is toward the forehead, and caudal, which is toward the spinal cord. We have several lobes we'll talk about today. The frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, occipital lobe, and the insula. So we'll talk a little bit about the functions of those lobes. So one reason why the brain is so amazingly functional for humans and allow humans a great capacity for thought and judgment and planning is that it's extremely folded. So there's an extremely large surface area of the brain due to the folds, extensive folds that increase the surface area. The cerebral cortex itself is only 3 millimeters of gray matter. In general, the frontal lobes are responsible for motor functions, and we'll look at how the cerebral cortex, particularly the motor cortex, is devoted to different parts of the body that have the most muscles. So you might be surprised to see which parts of the body have the most muscles. Also, the frontal cortex is involved with planning, mood, smell, and social judgment. The parietal lobe receives and integrates sensory information. There is a cortex known as the post-central gyrus, or the post-central sulcus cortex. The occipital lobe is a visual center of the brain. The temporal areas for hearing, smell, learning, memory, and emotional behavior. And of course, the insula, the most recently discovered lobe, which is responsible in part for language. So you may be wondering, how does the brain communicate with other parts of the brain? So we saw that in the spinal cord there are tracts. Tracts like the spinocerebellar tract, tracts that hold long axons in nerves. And there are tracts of white matter, tracts of axons in the brain as well. Tracts of cerebral white matter. The cortex, of course, is gray matter, and there's deep gray matter, but the tracts in the lobes of the brain are called association tracts. So that's one type of tract, association tracts. And you can see them here. They connect within and between lobes. They connect within and between lobes. Projection tracts project out of the brain. Projection tracts. So they extend from the brain to the spinal cord. The other kind of tract is called commissural. Commissural tracts. And they cross from one hemisphere to the other, connecting the two hemispheres. They're within a structure called the corpus callosum. It's interesting. The other day, I was watching a show, and the question on the show was, which parts of your body can you do without? Which parts of your body can you do without? Think about that for a second. You probably know a whole bunch of them. Which parts of your body can you do without? Can you do without the appendix, for example? If you think you can do without the appendix, do a thumbs up. Yeah, some people have their appendix removed. What other structures? Some of your limbs. Yes, you can survive without your limbs. Your tonsils, you can survive without your tonsils. Good. And it turns out you can survive with one hemisphere of your brain removed. So what happens is the other hemisphere makes up for what's lacking and can start to form synapses that perform the functions that the other hemisphere used to perform. Really, the brain is quite remarkable. So of course you do need to keep it active. And later on, we'll talk about what's known as cerebral lateralization. So the left hemisphere of the brain is responsible for different things than the right hemisphere. So you might already be aware of the left hemisphere being kind of more mathematical and the right hemisphere being a little bit more on the artistic side. Yeah, a whole hemisphere. Yes, it's been known to happen. So most of the cerebrum is white matter. Here are the tracts again: projection tracts, commissural tracts, and association tracts. So one problem with the brain is known as fetal alcohol syndrome. I don't seem to have that slide here, so I'll just write a few things about that. Fetal alcohol syndrome. So that is quite serious because the ingestion of alcohol when a fetus is housed in the uterus is a direct transfer of alcohol to the fetus, because alcohol is very dissolvable. It crosses the plasma membrane between the placenta vessels and the fetus vessels very readily, and it can affect the brain. In particular, it affects the corpus callosum. It's smaller. It's smaller. It doesn't develop properly. And it reduces the size of the basal ganglia. That's something we'll talk about. That's deep gray matter. So an FAS, a fetal alcohol syndrome baby, may have a smaller head, and impaired nervous function. may also have poor coordination, perhaps hyperactivity. It depends on the severity. Thanks, Jen, for that link. Good. The cerebral cortex is interestingly quite thin, 3 only millimeters thick. Part of the cortex, 90%, is known as neocortex. Neocortex, that means the newest part of the cortex. And the newest part of the cortex, just a sec, I need to admit someone here. The newest part of the cortex has been around for only about 60,000 years. So not very long. And sorry, not 60,000, sorry, 60 million. Whereas vertebrates have been around for much longer than that. Vertebrates have been around for 600 million years. So relatively, it's relatively new, the cerebral cortex. And it consists of different kinds of cells, pyramidal cells, stellate cells, and large pyramidal cells. Some tend to project to the spinal cord, and some communicate within the lobes. So with these cells, synapses occur within and between lobes. Synapses, I should say, of some cells, and some cells project out of the cerebral cortex toward the spinal cord, the cerebral cortex. Basal nuclei are masses of gray matter that are deep to the cortex. They are known as corpus striatum, and there are several sections, the caudate nucleus, the putamen, and the globus pallidus. So they receive information from the substantia nigra and the motor cortex. So they're involved in motor control, the basal nuclei, involved in motor control. And damage to this region can result in tremors as well. The limbic system. We had a little bit of an introduction to the limbic system with our video on the teen genius, where they tested him for functions and whether his frontal lobe or his amygdala activated with different functions. So the limbic system consists of the structure, the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the cingulate gyrus. The cingulate gyrus, the amygdala, and the hippocampus. And there's a role of emotion and memory. That's part of the limbic system. So, but with a teen, so in adolescence, the role has more to do with hormones, if you recall, drives, and emotions. So how do we know how the brain is functioning, or which, I should say, how do we know which part of the brain is functioning when we're doing different activities, when we're thinking different things? Is it a different part of the brain? Is it a different part of the brain, do you think, when you're reading as opposed to when you're writing? Is it different when you're forming speech? And yeah, it is different. And we can measure differences with an electroencephalogram. And we can measure brain waves, for example. 4 different kinds of brain waves are alpha, beta, theta, and delta. And they vary in frequency and amplitude. Amplitude is the height, and frequency is how often they fire or have action potentials. So the electroencephalogram can record voltage changes. So what do these different kinds of waves indicate? An alpha wave will occur when an individual is awake but resting with eyes closed. Beta waves occur when the eyes are open and there are mental tasks being performed. Theta waves occur in sleep, but also in emotional stress. Delta waves occur in deep sleep. Sleep has different stages. And brain waves change during those phases and cycles of sleep. So the stages are, first you're fully awake, drowsy, light sleep, deep sleep, very deep sleep, and then, REM sleep, rapid eye movement. And with rapid eye movement sleep, your vital signs are almost as waking. So the heart rate goes up, the respiratory rate goes up again. And I'll answer a couple of those questions shortly. So the interesting thing about REM sleep is that throughout a night of sleeping, it occurs several times. So here it occurs just for a very short time, a little bit longer, 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 and longer still. And that stage of sleep is the time when, so vital signs increase. There's eye movement under eyelids. Dreams occur, and penile erections occur at this time as well. It's thought that it may help to sort out memories. So the purpose of REM sleep, maybe, may help sort memories or occurrences that occurred during the daytime. So there have been experiments where people have been deprived of REM sleep, and it's quite detrimental to brain function. Cognition. Cognition includes mental processes such as awareness, being aware of one's surroundings, being aware of individuals in your vicinity, being aware of uh, body language, perception, interpreting senses as being something specific. Like interpreting, for example, oh, I can smell this. That's my sense of smell. But I perceive that it's a rose because I know from memory what a rose smells like. Perception, thinking, so sorting and remembering, knowledge accumulated with experience, and a memory. So how do we know? I think I asked that question before. How do we know which part of the brain is responsible for different functions? And often it's because of injury. So this famous injury of Phineas Gage, who was working on a railroad, and an explosion sent a pipe through his head. Before that happened, he was a very calm, kind of normal, very polite individual. And afterwards, it destroyed the ventromedial region of both the frontal lobes, and his personality changed. He became very irreverent, he swore a lot, he became very restless. Yeah, so for that reason, and also many other studies, of course, since Phineas Gage, that is why planning, moral judgment, and emotional control are known to be functions of the prefrontal cortex. So often it's because of injury that we know what's happened in what part of the brain is responsible for what. So let me just add a little bit here. 75% of the cerebrum is association areas. Association areas of integration between sensory and motor neurons. So what occurs if you affect different lobes? If the parietal lobe is injured, so if there's a lesion to the parietal lobe, it results in a disorder known as contralateral neglect syndrome. And so from one side of the body, the parietal lobe is not getting sensory information. So there are no motor reactions to that side of the body. Remember, contralateral is opposite. And that's because of decussation in the spinal cord of the sensory and motor neurons. So the individual is not aware of the other side of the body. So an individual, for example, a male might just shave half the face. Yeah. So what about injury to, I should write that down here, sorry, injury as in lesions or trauma to the parietal lobe. What about the temporal lobe? It results, interestingly, in a disorder known as agnosia, which is the inability to recognize objects. There's another name for the inability to recognize faces, and that's another part of the temporal lobe. And that is known as prosopagnosia. Prosopagnosia. That's the inability to recognize faces. And so that's how we know that that part of the brain functions in that capacity to recognize faces or to recognize objects. And the frontal lobe we've seen, an inability to plan. And other functions. So what else can we use to discover which part of brain activates in specific functions? As above, like recognizing options, for example. What other functions? Sorry, what other methods? Well, there's a scanner known as a PET scanner. I don't know if you've heard of that. PET, positron emission tomography. And that is a scan whereby an individual is injected, usually with an isotope, often of glucose. And the brain is scanned for active regions. And you know it's active because the glucose is being used there, is concentrated there, and gives off radiation. And there's more radiation where the glucose is concentrated. Other trauma to the brain, such as stroke, for example. Stroke can lead to different dysfunction, different parts of the body that are paralyzed because they don't get motor sensation, or sorry, motor innervation, I should say. Memory. What is memory? It's an information management system. It doesn't require only memory. It requires learning something, making that a memory, and also forgetting. So forgetting, so eliminating, for example, trivia. eliminating trivia. That's not required for survival or for basic function. If someone has a very difficult time forgetting, it can interfere with reading comprehension. Anterograde amnesia is a disorder where no new memories can be stored, and retrograde amnesia is a disorder where old memories cannot be remembered. The hippocampus is a structure that organizes sensory and cognitive information into a new memory. So damage to the hippocampus will result in no new memories being formed. The cerebellum helps to learn motor skills and to memorize those, and the amygdala helps in emotional memory. How are emotions controlled? Well, emotions are not exclusively cerebral. The endocrine system has a lot to do with emotions and emotional control. But the parts of the brain that are involved in emotional control are the prefrontal cortex. It controls expression, so judgment. In which situations should emotions be expressed? And the hypothalamus and amygdala, emotions are formed. Emotions like fear, anger, pleasure, love, etc. Those kinds of emotions are formed there. And so if those areas are artificially stimulated, then particularly if it stimulates feelings of pleasure, then people will even forego food. And much of our behavior is learned by rewards and punishments. So that's how you learn. Another part of the brain is responsible for somesthetic sensation, sensation of the skin and of the skeletal muscles. There are receptors over your entire body for senses such as touch, pressure, stretch, temperature, and pain. These signals travel up the gracile and cuneate fasciculi and the spinal thalamic tract of the spinal cord. They decussate, go to the thalamus, which does some editing, and then to the cerebral cortex. The part of the cerebral cortex that is responsible is the postcentral gyrus, here shown in purple, the postcentral gyrus. Somesthetic sensation. So that's where it ends up. And the parietal lobe is responsible for integrating that sensory information and then sending signals to the motor cortex here, which will respond to those sensations. So the postcentral gyrus is sensory, and the precentral is motor. So the postcentral gyrus is in the parietal lobe, and the motor cortex, sorry, that's the sensory cortex. The motor cortex which is in the frontal lobe. In the frontal lobe. And so the parts of this cortex that are devoted to different parts of the body varies. So where there are more receptors, you would expect to find more of the cortex to be devoted. And we can show that with a diagram known as a sensory homunculus, which is a human form. It demonstrates the area of the cortex dedicated to sensations of various parts of the body, which are proportional to how sensitive those parts of the body are. So as you would expect, your fingers, very sensitive. A large portion is devoted to your fingers and your hand and your mouth, your lips, your face and your nose and your eyes. There are a lot of receptors in those various areas. That's the sensory homunculus. So there are some other functional regions in the cerebral cortex. So this is where sensory information is integrated and motor response developed and sent to the motor cortex. So they are known as association areas. In the parietal lobe, you have the somatic association area where your somatic sensations are integrating and deciding on a response. I'd like to talk about a few other ones. The gustatory cortex, that has to do with taste. Wernicke's area we'll talk about separately. The visual association area is responsible for vision, integrating visual information. The auditory area and auditory association areas, that's where the hearing senses are integrated. Olfactory association area, where your senses of smell come in and are integrated. That's where you can make sense of smells like, yeah, this is a rose and this is not a rose. This is, I don't know, mint. Yeah, okay, I'd like to talk about Broca's separately. The motor association area is responsible for signals sent to the motor cortex, which will go to the body. Special senses are those that are concentrated in the head. Concentrated in the head. Senses such as smell, vision, hearing, and equilibrium. Special senses are separate from general senses. General senses are throughout the body and they include touch and pressure and pain. But these are special senses. They're concentrated in the head. So where are the locations? Regions of association areas. Where integration occurs. Taste is found in the lower end of the postcentral gyrus. Smell Smell is found in the medial temporal lobe. Vision is found in the occipital lobe. And hearing is in the superior temporal lobe. Equilibrium is mainly in the cerebellum. Those are your special senses. These association areas, sensory association areas, interpret sensory information. Somacetic, for example, in the parietal lobe, interprets the position of the limbs and will respond with motor signals for balance, for example. The association area will determine the location of touch or pain, the shape of objects, the weight and texture of an object. So those sensory signals are sent to these association areas of the brain where the signals are interpreted. The visual association area identifies the things that we see, a tree or grass. Faces in particular are recognized, however, in the temporal lobe. The auditory association area, also in the temporal lobe, is a place where you can recall the name of a piece of music or identify a person by voice, for example. That occurs in those association areas. The motor homunculus, where motor signals are sent to the body, and the motor cortex, are also relative to the number of muscles in those various areas. So the motor homunculus is proportional to the number of muscle units in a region. So some regions have very fine control, so it corresponds to the sensory areas of the homunculus. So the hand, the fingers, the thumb, the face, the lips, the jaw. The tongue has quite a lot of innervation. It's quite a large muscle. It's not, however, the strongest muscle. What do you think is the strongest muscle as in pounds per square inch of the body? This is a total aside to what we're talking about, but well, not really, I guess. What is that? What do you think? The uterus. Thank you, Jenny. Yeah, the uterus. Yeah, I just learned that too. Of course. Good. The motor homunculus. What about the basal nuclei? So the cerebral cortex has a feedback circuit with the basal nuclei, which integrates some more complicated movements. So very practice movements, for example, starting and stopping movements, walking. Dyskinesias and unwanted movements can occur as a result of damage to the basal nuclei. This brings us to the cerebellum. The cerebellum, as we said before, has about 50% of the brain's neurons, although it's only 10% of the size. Cerebellum, which is responsible for motor skills, muscle tone, posture, smooth muscle contractions. It compares the intention of actual movement and sends a signal to adjust. So the intention comes from the motor cortex. Input and output to the cerebellum comes from various sources. There's input from the cerebrum, from the pons, from the reticular formation, and from proprioceptors in the muscle and joints, which end up traveling up the spinal cerebellar tracts to the cerebellum. Output is from the cerebellum, is to the thalamus, to the midbrain, down the rubrospinal tract, to the limbs. From the pons and medulla, there's also an exiting of signals down the reticulospinal tract and vestibulospinal tracts, which also control the limbs and postural muscles. So the cerebellum smooths muscle contractions, maintains muscle tone and posture, coordinates movements of joints, your body joints, not the ones you smoke. Sorry, I just have to throw that in. It aids in learning motor skills, such as dancing and sports. And it coordinates eye movements, up or down, or side to side, coordinates eye movements. So language is quite, sorry, I've been asked to slow down a little bit. I'll try to slow down a little bit. Language is quite complex. I really admire people who speak a lot of languages. I speak German. My parents were German. I learned it growing up. Of course, that's the best time to learn because that's when all of your synapses are occurring. You know, they're forming. You're growing new dendrites all the time when you're young. And so that's a good time to learn a language. I think it was Saturday. My friends brought their kids along for trick or treat. So they were just going to some very specific places with their kids. So I was chosen to be one of those places. And the young kid, who's 6, speaks Spanish, German, and English, and really quite fluently. It's quite amazing. At only 6 years old. His father is Mexican, his mother German, and so he's learning all these 3 languages at the same time. It's amazing. So, but language doesn't include just learning the words, of course, but it includes learning grammar. It includes formulating sentences. Language includes reading. There's a few different centers that are devoted to language. There's a speech center of the motor cortex. So that involves planning speech, planning which muscles will be formed and how they will contract in order to form certain words. There's Broca's area, which generates a program. I'm going to write this down in a second, for the larynx, the tongue, the cheeks, and the lips. So let me just write some notes about those. I'll try to write a little more slowly. So language includes reading, writing, speaking, and understanding words. Wernicke's area permits recognition of spoken and written language. And it also creates a plan for speech. Creates a plan for speech. The angular gyrus processes text into a form that we can speak. In German, the vowels are a little bit different. And we used to learn them like this. A, E, I, O, U. Das Mund geht immer weiter zu. That means that when you're saying the vowels, A, E, I, O, U, and then the next phrase is das Mund geht immer weiter zu, means the mouth gets smaller and smaller as you're saying the vowels. But in German, there's also vowels that are different depending on if they have two little dots on top of them. So the vowel O, for example, O becomes Ö if it's got two dots. The vowel U becomes Ü. Yeah, so German is a little bit more complicated when it comes to vowels anyway. So Broca's area generates a motor program. For the different parts of the mouth that are involved in speech, the larynx is where your vocal cords are, all your vocal cords, the tongue, cheeks, and lips. And it transmits that to the primary motor cortex. Through synapses for action. So there are some issues, I'll just leave that there for a second. There are some issues with language deficits that occur from lesions to different areas of the brain. And those are aphasia, known as aphasia. Language deficit from lesions in the same hemisphere as Wernicke and Broca areas. A lesion to the Broca area will result in non-fluent aphasia, so speech is very slow and difficult, but it does make sense. If there is a lesion to Wernicke's, language is fluent. It's normal, but it doesn't make sense. It's nonsensical language. Anomic aphasia, speech and understanding are normal, but text and pictures make no sense. And there are other lesions. So other lesions, whoopsie. Other lesions result in sort of odd things like understanding only the first half of words. And there's one case where an individual could write only consonants. So you have two hemispheres. You have your left hemisphere and your right hemisphere. Are they only on one side? That is a good question. Broca's and I believe so. I believe so, but let me check that later. I believe they are only on one side. But I'm not positive. It could be on both sides. So lateralization just means that the different hemispheres have slightly different functions. So different functions between the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. So the left hemisphere, for example, has right hand motor control, and the right hemisphere left hand motor control because of crossing over. There's a right ear advantage in hearing vocal sounds, and there's a left ear advantage in hearing non-vocal sounds. So sounds that are other than speech. So it's very interesting. Cerebral lateralization. Here's a nice diagram. So it shows things like math, language, science, writing, logic. Loosely, they are more prominent in the left hemisphere, whereas functions such as dance, sculpture, art appreciation, music appreciation, perception, they may be more of a right hemisphere kind of function. So let me write that down in words. So the left hemisphere is kind of known as a categorical hemisphere. It's specialized for spoken and written language, sequential and analytical reasoning, math and science, for example, analyzing data in a linear way as opposed to a more abstract way. The right hemisphere is more representational. So perceiving, for example, information more holistically. In a more abstract fashion. Perception of spatial relationships. Patterns. Imagination. And insight. Music. And artistic skill. So lateralization develops with age, interestingly. In other words, the hemisphere is becoming more specialized. If there is trauma to either side of the brain, it can be more severe in males because females have more communication between the two hemispheres. So in females, the corpus callosum is thicker posteriorly. And so trauma may not be as severe in females. So I'm going to stop there. That's okay. The end of the brain. So good. Thank you for your attention.